Hello, it has been well over a month now since I did my last installment of Horror Nights history, which was part 4, I believe, for Halloween Horror Nights 16, Sweet 16. And there's reasons for the delay, many reasons. Part of it was not just the problems I was having with audio, which hopefully will not continue, but also I had planned something really cool and special for you when I got to some of the other houses presented that year, and I wanted to work on it very carefully, and so it'd be ready for you when I would do it. And there were some various issues and problems which delayed it even further in order to get this ready for you. And most recently something has happened which has further delayed it. And so if I wait until all these things are resolved and finish this, well then it may not be until June before I get this up. And I thought today, well, you know, I'm not doing anything else. I'm kind of taking it easy for some of the same reasons that I'll get into in a minute. And I might as well do the video now and get it out to you so that at least you'll be able to see this, and maybe sometime in the future you'll see the other thing that I was hoping to show you today. And again, I'll get to that when I get to that point on the video, if I ever get there within 15 minutes, of course. Anyway, that out of the way, pardon, I was talking at the end of the previous video last month, whenever it was March, I think, March 19th or some silly thing. Quite some, now it's May 1st already, so it's been quite some time, about the haunted house, People Under the Stairs Under Construction, and I began to run out of time at the end of it. And I was complaining about the fact that it was too brightly lit. It was very bright in there, and the whole point of wearing the helmet and being able to not see in the dark and only have the spotlight was redundant. It was stupid. Why would they have a helmet house if it wasn't dark and you could see anything anyway? The whole helmets became completely, superfluous, and there was no point of it. And that really pissed me off, and I was quite angry about the whole thing. And I had prepared to say some very mean things about the house at the beginning of this video. Then something interesting happened. I had said I mentioned a few things. I was trying to be fair about it, but I found out, in fact, there were a couple of serious problems that occurred when I went in that house. As I said in the previous video, I was only able to go in the house once, around 11 p.m. on that first Friday evening of Halloween Horror Nights 16. The actual original date, and I don't remember what it is off the top of my head now, but shortly after I made that video, I went to Mardi Gras at Universal Studios. Possibly the same day I went to Mardi Gras at Universal Studios, and while I was attending and watching the Mardi Gras parade, just standing next to me watching the parade was a friend of mine named Charles Bremer, who uses the alias Dr. Raymond Holmes. And I would like to give a shout out to him now for his new blog, Designing the Fear. I think it's designingfear.com or something like that. Go find it. You can also find links to it at his Facebook page, also for Designing the Fear. He has that on Facebook as well as his own Facebook. And so he's it's a really well done blog. Hardly any of the spelling errors or grammatical errors he usually has in his average postings of various places, but maybe it's Nancy who edits that. I don't know. He needs a good editor, and Nancy, I think, is a good editor. But shout out to the two of them. They do a great job on that blog. Anyway, he actually played in one of the two casts in People Under the Stairs, the Gimp, Daddy Gimp character that I never saw. And so he knew better than I did what was going on, and I was able to tell him, when did you go in the house? And I said, well, it was in fact the very first night at about 11 p.m. He says, oh, because he could remember quite well what happened at that time. First of all, apparently there had been some sort of fire alarm or something, and after that had been done, not everybody got back into the house. So that's why he wasn't there when I went through it, and why very few characters at all were in the house, because they had evacuated it and only had just started coming back in when they started letting guests through again at the moment that I happened to be unlucky enough to go through. The other problem was they had all sorts of lighting problems on the first night that year, and therefore the house was brightly lit during the first night. Later during the event, if I had been able to go back on separate nights and go through the house again, I would have seen it the way it was meant to be presented, with the lights turned way down and dark, and with more characters, including the GIMP character and everything else, the way it should have been. So, in effect, I really did not have a decent presentation of the house when I went through it, and so that does reflect my very negative review of it. At the same time, however, I have heard from many people who have gone through that house, who during times when it was done correctly, when the lights were down and there were more characters in the house, also found the house lackluster and didn't like it very much. And it remains, nevertheless, one of the least popular houses of that year. In fact, Charles himself didn't like it, and says he doesn't mind if you say the house sucks. And he was a character in the house, a key character actually, playing one of the leads from the movie in the house, and he didn't like it. So I guess, you know, it really was a sucky house one way or another. But I just had very bad luck of hitting the house at its time of most egregious suckhood. So it was bad luck on my part. It would have sucked less, but not. It still would have sucked, but it would have sucked significantly less if I had been able to go to the house a few more times on other nights. C'est la vie. Yeah, Afghan Glay and all those other funny words that mean shit happens. Okay, now, next house. So let's go on to the next house. The next house is the house that was presented in Sprung Tent number 2. It is in fact the very first house to ever be presented in Sprung Tent number 2, which is of course the house that would be, as you go in towards the houses from the queue lines, usually on the right hand side. The one where most recently they had the I believe the catacombs, I think, were in that house this past year, and Dogs of War Havoc was in Sprung Tent 1 this past year. So that you got an idea of what house I'm talking about. So that Sprung Tent number 2 was the debuted with the house called Psychopath: The Return of Norman Bates. And just as every other house in 2006, this was a repeat or a redoing of old houses that had appeared in previous years. Of course, the original Norman Bates or Psycho houses debuted in the year 1993 at Halloween Horror Nights 3. Really was only the third house ever presented at Halloween Horror Nights. I say that because the first year they had one house, the second year they had two houses, one of which was a repeat and the other was People Under the Stairs. And so the next year, this was the third. And it was based, of course, on Universal's classic movie Psycho, although that was not originally a Universal picture. It was a Paramount picture when it was first released in 1960, I believe, but Hitchcock transferred all the rights to Universal before he died, and it remains a Universal property to this day. And of course, in those years we had the Psycho Bates Mansion and the hotel reproduced for us to enjoy, where now there's a kid zone, basically. Now, that year, they no longer had that wonderful backdrop to place the house at, so they had to do something else. 1994 and 1995, they had the repeats of the same house, and then they brought it back one last time before then in 1998 during Primal Scream. That time it was a soundstage house, because by then they didn't have the buildings, and that one was called Through the Mind of Norman Bates, and was more of a psychological thing. This had elements of both the original Psychopath houses from the early 90s and the more recent Through the Mind of Norman Bates house, and it had both the psychological but also recreating the Bates Hotel. And they did this with a magnificent facade. The whole front of the Sprung Tent was superimposed an actual recreation of the Bates Motel. And if you, when Horror Nights BE cover comes back, that wonderful website is currently down apparently because Nick Curto has let it lapse and hasn't repaid whatever hosting he has to do. Nick, if you're listening to me, bring horrornightsback.be back up as soon as possible, please. Another shout out. Wonderful website, if we get it back again. So you can see the actual website for Halloween Horror Nights 16 again, and if you go there you can watch the videos of the construction of this house, when they were building the facade, and it's quite marvelous. They actually created the Bates Motel from scratch and put it there as a facade. When you entered in, it was just like going into, you actually went into Norman Bates' office with the stuffed birds and things in the back room, and the radio is playing that Norman is on the loose and you need to look out for him and all of that, and you go through the house, you go through various rooms and scenes from Psycho, as well as the more psychological rooms that were like what's going on in Norman's twisted mind, where you have like whole rows of shower curtains and mad mothers with knives coming at you from each angle, like what the hell, and eyeballs and daggers superimposed and projections on the wall and stuff. So it had lots of, it sort of combined elements of all the previous Psycho houses in a brilliant way, and it was quite nifty and well done, and I enjoyed that house tremendously. Now, the fourth house from that year is called Run Hostile Territory, and that house was the house presented in the earthquake queue that year, where the original Run, I believe, had been located when it, I think, or was that Nazerman's? I don't have time to go and look it up, but anyway, it was it was of course the follow-up to the original Run house way back in the year 2001, and if you recall, that house, of course, was originally meant to showcase Eddie. I talked quite a bit about the original house before, but this time they thought, okay, we're going to give Eddie his own house at last, and he was in the house, although the Eddie presented in that year wasn't the best looking Eddie we've ever seen. Nowhere near as spectacular as the Eddies who appeared in both the Scare Zone and House, the retrospective Scare Zone and House that we saw this past year. They improved Eddie's appearance tremendously. The house also was based somewhat on the motion picture Hostel. Not directly, of course, but it's sort of a pun. Hostel, H-O-S-T-E-L, and Hostel, H-O-S-T-I-L-E, in a way. So it was Run Hostile Territory, not hostile as a like a youth hostel, but hostile territory. But it did sort of pun on the name, and it did have scenes of torture that were quite similar to the torture warehouse that was presented in that motion picture, which had come out quite recently before then. And so it was a fairly effective house with some really neat special effects of torture scenes and being chased around by maniacs with chainsaws and things, including Eddie. And but it hardly lived up to the reputation of the original Run, and certainly did not live up to the original concept of Run, which has never been fully realized to this day. And again, there are places you can go and look and hear about how that was originally supposed to have been, and I believe I talked about it quite considerably in my videos for 2001, so you can review those. But it was nice to actually see Eddie live in person in a house. It wasn't the first time, though, because he actually did appear in the Horror Night Nightmares house in 2004, so this was actually Eddie's second appearance, rather than his first. Alright, now we come to the part where I talk a little bit about why this video was delayed. When I was going to do this video originally, my idea was to present this beautiful visual presentation for you. The next house is Scream House Resurrection. Scream House Resurrection, which was in Soundstage 23 and was a brought back of the classic Scream House from 2002, Islands of Adventure, first year Islands of Fear, featuring the Caretaker, and then of course was revisited in 2003. The facade, I was going to say, well, here's the facade, and I'm going to bring up this beautiful paper model. See, and the website for Halloween Horror Nights 2006 had two lovely PDFs where you could download a paper model for both the Scream House and the Psychoscarapy houses that year, and you could build your own version of the facade rather beautifully out of paper with cutting and pasting. And I was going to do that and present it for you. Unfortunately, I had some printer issues and some ink issues, and it took a couple of weeks to resolve those. Once all that was done, I had been working on it, but then I had this problem that happened to me just this past few days, which prevented me from finishing. And I'm running out of time now, but essentially I had a medical emergency which involved a torn retina in my left eye. This has all been handled. I've had emergency surgery with lasers yesterday, and I'm fine. I'll continue this on the next video. That's a terrible place to leave off, isn't it?